book review of Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Pulitzer Prize winning author Isabel Wilkerson. We have some incredible panelists who will discuss their perspectives on the book. We're also celebrating Black History Month, so it's appropriate that we're talking about this book this month. I want to first introduce our glorious leader, our queen, Robin Jacobs. She is chairwoman of our Executive Board of Governors. Robin.
Thank you for that kind introduction that my mom really appreciates. Thank you. And she's on, you know that.
Oh, wow. Hi, Mom.
February marks the start of Black History Month, a federally recognized celebration of the contributions of African Americans have made to this country, and a time to reflect on the continued struggle for racial justice. Experts say understanding Black history and learning more about systemic racism is essential for our country. The Miami Beach Chamber of Commerce Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council was established almost a year and a half ago through the efforts of our fabulous co-chairs, André Williams and Eva Diaz, Deanne Conley Graham, our president and CEO, Jerry Libin, and Sabrina Graham Foster. We applaud each and every one of them for this accomplishment. And I'm so proud that the DE&I Council was established during my chairmanship. Today, we mark Black History Month at the Chamber with this discussion of Caste by Isabella Wilkerson. This book provides us a view of America's hierarchy that few will ever consider or discuss. Wilkerson believes that understanding this system is the first step to changing how we approach each other with humanity and understanding, not based on physical appearance. As chair of the chamber, I'm privileged to welcome all of you here today, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. And next, I'd like to introduce Susan Harper. She's the Consul General of Canada in Miami. Susan, are you with us? Well, in her absence, I just want to, Susan? Okay, well, in her absence, I just want you all to know she's the newest member of the Miami Beach Chamber of Commerce. She's a former ambassador to Uruguay. She's committed to supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion, and she is a direct sponsor of our DE&I Council. Thank you so much, Susan, for your support. This next woman really needs no introduction. That is Deanne Conley Graham, our godmother. She's another chamber member, and she helped start the DE&I. She heads up our Women's Council. And Deanne, you're one of our African-American heroes. This is Black History Month. So just share just a few passing words welcoming people to our panel discussion today. Mute.
Can we unmute Deanne?
Okay.
There we go. We're still muted, Deanne. Deanne, unmute.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me now?
We got you.
All right.
Yes.
Between me and Alicia. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I'm very, very excited to be participating as part of the Women's Business Council. We fully support the work of our DE&I Council, and we're looking forward to doing a number of collaborative events together. As minorities, women, as well as other minorities, definitely need to have the spotlight focused on our accomplishments and what we're going to be doing going forward. So I look forward to this discussion, and I'm looking forward to future collaborations with DE&I. And I want to acknowledge co-chair Eva Diaz as part of that DE&I as well, and looking forward to working with her on a certification program we're going to be bringing to the chamber to help get our minority businesses certified so that we can be competitive in the economic market. Well, thank you, Andre, for bringing these amazing panelists together, and I look forward to the discussion.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And just to share with you all, the DE&I, Eva, myself, Deanne, Robin, and Jerry, we helped sponsor some legislation at the city that now empowers local Black businesses. The city now has a special program to allow these sorts of businesses to participate in any city-owned contracting. So we're very excited about that. Now we're gonna this is going to be a very interactive process. We certainly want questions from you all. So if you could put your questions in the chat room, during the discussion, something might creep into your mind. And we hope to get to all of your questions. If you're interested in joining the chamber, we have Sabrina Graham. You can directly contact her in the chat, and she can talk to you about all the benefits of joining the chamber as well. Before I introduce the panelists, I just want to share my personal story with you, because any discussion on caste racism in the United States is very personal to most African Americans, including myself. My mom is a retired public school teacher with a graduate degree from the University of Wisconsin, but she grew up in absolute and abject poverty in a small rural town in Georgia, population about 3,000 or 4,000. She was raised by my grandmother, a single mom with her 4 siblings in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. There were no real jobs for Black folks during that time frame. Maybe you cleaned a house for a white family if you were lucky. I grew up hearing stories of my mother picking cotton from sunrise to sundown in the months before school started, which was a little bit later for her because they were picking cotton during those early months of school. In fact, she picked cotton on the day before traveling to college. She still boasts today about how she was a prolific cotton picker and could pick 300 pounds of cotton a day. So that's her claim to fame. My father was a Marine. He retired from the Postal Service. And I heard stories from him and echoed by my grandfather. They were day laborers and construction workers on our beloved Miami Beach in the 50s and 60s. They also worked sunrise to sundown, but they had to be off of Miami Beach by sundown or be subject to arrest. So in spite of this adversity and in these dire circumstances, my parents prospered. Their blood, sweat, and tears paid for my Harvard education. So there is prosperity, there is hope, even in the midst of the scourge of Jim Crow and racism. Most African Americans, like me, are just a generation removed from this Jim Crow, from this racism and subjugation. So it's really close to most of us. So I'll introduce our first panelist, and her name is Professor Heather Russell, and she and I have a lot to talk about, or we all have a lot to talk about with her today. Professor Heather Russell is a professor of literature and senior associate dean for the School of Environment, Arts, and Society in the College of Arts, Sciences, and Education at Florida International University, where she has taught since 2003. Her book, Legba's Crossing, Narratology in the African Atlantic, published in 2009, is part of a general body of scholarship on Black modernity. She is co-editor of a second book, a collection of essays on Barbadian singer Rihanna, and has published on a wide array of subjects related to African-American and Afro-Caribbean scholarly concerns, with essays on Quentin Tarantino's Django, Marcus Garvey, and popular culture, and on quilting in African-American women's literature. In keeping with her commitment to the study of the humanities over the past 10 years, she has worked with various state-based affiliates of the National Endowment for the Humanities and with the National Humanities Center. She was named one of South Florida's top educational leaders for 2014, and in 2016 by Legacy Magazine. She's currently on the Florida Consortium. She's serving on the Florida Consortium of Metropolitan Universities Year Reflection Committee, established by the presidents of FIU, UCF, and USF. Professor Heather Russell, thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Andre. I want to begin by saying how pleased I am to be here with you, sharing in a discussion of what to my mind is a paradigm shifting book. Necessary reading, I think, for anyone who wants a good understanding of the foundations upon which the American social, political, cultural scene is actually organized. I want to say a special thank you to Andre for inviting me and to the Miami Beach Chamber of Commerce's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council for being willing to create a space for an open dialogue around race and caste at a Chamber of Commerce meeting. Where typically discuss issues like financial opportunities, access to capital, investment opportunities, real estate, visions you want this city to be. And I want to begin by suggesting that these questions of commerce are radically and deeply rooted in America's racial history and contemporary manifestations of that history. And these, of course, form the subject of what the historian Isabel Wilkerson so profoundly lays out in her New York Times bestselling book. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a short PowerPoint I'm going to share with you. Okay. So I wasn't sure how many of the audience would have actually read the book. I thought it might be useful to actually delve a little deeply into what Wilkerson means by caste, and to really tease out some of the distinctions she draws in relation to and between caste and race. Most of us are familiar with terms like race, racism. We talk in terms of black and white, but caste for many of us is new, right? It's a new term, and so I thought, in the time that I have, I would sort of and give some examples of really what she means by caste. So Wilkerson writes, she says, caste and race are neither synonymous nor mutually exclusive. They can and do coexist in culture and serve to reinforce each other. Race in the United States is the visible agent of the unseen force of caste. Caste is the bones, race, the skin. So to try to educate what she means by this, I want to turn to a case that's recently in the news that's related to the rebranding of the Aunt Jemima brand, the rebranding to the Pearl Milling Company. So this is a sort of classic iconography of African-American women during the early 20th century and really sort of persists well into the mid 20th century. And of course, the familiar image is the image of Aunt Jemima, who is drawn from an icon really that gets created during slavery that we come to know as Mammy, right? A Mammy figure. And so the Mammy figure serves a really important function in terms of bolstering, right? Making the case for slavery really being a benign, a beneficent institution. Because Mammy is depicted as a happy in her role, happy in her servitude, happy in her domesticity. You can see from the representation that she, this is, as I said, in the 20th century, this image continues to serve, and it continues to serve and becomes then invoked and used to sell all kinds of products. And if you look at iconography from the period, it's really quite fascinating to see the persistence of these stereotypes and notions. So we see, just if we look at this advertisement, right, both the visual representation, right, of the Mammy figure, right, in the face of in the identity of Aunt Jemima, but also if you look at the middle portion, right, we needs, right. So again, it's telling that it's purveying this notion, right, of what Aunt Jemima's level of level of education might be, right? So she gets used, as I said, to really bolster this idea of a benign South, of slavery as a institution within which African Americans are generally happy and like family, right? And so the need to to maintain this notion, as I said, persists well into the 20th century. And even with the rebranding that we get, and you'll see at the slide, the figure of the sort of most recent Aunt Jemima iconography, right? Some things are shifted. The head tie, the head wrap is gone, but some of the images remain the same. And one of the other critical things that I think is important to understand is that Mammy, in the representation, she has to be stripped of any kind of sort of desirability, sexual allure. Why? Because she's working in the household, right? So you can't afford for her to be, potentially desirable, and so we have to represent her as not posing a threat. So we get the rebranding. So in terms of sort of race, right? Wilkerson says race is what we can see, the physical traits that have been given arbitrary meaning and become shorthand for who a person is. So here in this case, the depictions and iconography and language used in the ad that we saw before are meant to assign meanings, such as she's suited for servitude and nothing more, right? She's yoked fully to the domestic sphere. Then we get the rebrand. So where does caste come into play? Wilkerson says caste is the powerful infrastructure that holds each group in place. Caste is fixed and rigid. Caste, for instance, is what keeps in place the idea that Black women belong in their roles as domestics, or in terms, essential workers, right? Whether we're talking about in factories or hotels, maintenance work, et cetera. So the Economic Policy Institute study last year published the following. So Black main jobs historically have been in low-wage agriculture and domestic service. Even after migration to the North during the 20th century, most employers would only hire Black women in domestic work. Black women have been the most likely of all women to be employed in the low-wage women's jobs that involve cooking, cleaning, caregiving, even though this work is generally speaking. And then finally today, nearly a third, 28% of Black women are employed in service jobs compared with just 1/5 of white women. So that's caste, right? That's caste operation. So as she says, race is fluid and superficial. Caste is fixed and rigid, right? So caste is what keeps in place what are the roles that the society deems fit for, in this case, Black women to assume. And we see that then bolstered and represented in advertising and popular culture, and so on and so forth. Okay, so when she talks about race, right, what do we mean by race? Race is fluid and superficial. So that's not something we sort of think about. We think of race as pretty fixed, right? You're Black, you're white, you're Asian, and so on. And so we tend to think of these categories as fairly rigid, but in fact, they're not. And so she points to really the making of the New World, in particular in the United States, within which, this is a moment when Europeans really become white. Right? So I wanted to share a clip from Nobel laureate Toni Morrison, an interview that she had with Bill Moyers, in which she's kind of talking about this moment in American history.
I'm not sure that's going to play.
Yeah, it's not playing, Heather.
Oh, it's not playing?
No, it's not
No.
playing.
Oh. Okay, hold on, let me see. Now, is it playing?
Yeah,
Go
there's
ahead.
no sound.
So, it is playing now?
Yeah, but no sound.
Go hit play and then let's hear if there's sound.
Okay, hold on. I was going back to where I was. Yep.
No sound.
Heather, if I may, before you click share screen, click share computer sound, and then it should work.
Ah, okay. So stop share. Well, listen, I don't want to eat up more time on this. I will share the link in the chat, and I would encourage everyone to if you get a chance to check out the interview. It's from 1990, but it's brilliant. And part of what she talks about in that clip is, how do you sort of, create an America? And so you have all of these immigrants from, they're fleeing war. They're from different classes, speaking different languages. But what they can do is not be Black. What they can do is become white. And so we then get the making of the white America. And so Wilkerson talks quite a bit about this notion and as being the beginnings then of caste, right? In the making of the new world, humans are set apart on the basis of what they looked like. This becomes the moment. Identified solely in contrast to one another and ranked to form a caste system based on a new concept called race. It was in this process of ranking that we were all cast into assigned roles. So how then does caste affect the daily lives of Black people? Well, Wilkerson would argue, right? She says, if there is anything that distinguishes caste, it is first the policing of roles expected of people based on what they look like. In other words, who belongs, who doesn't. Your notion in the chamber maybe of who's the desired tourist. What does an investor look like, right? We carry these notions with us, right? What does a viable investor sound like? Who does Miami Beach want is in for their tourists? And second then, the monitoring of boundaries, the disregard also of boundaries of subordinate caste. So I had a colleague, for instance, who she's directing a program, went to go see a potential donor who asked if he could touch her hair. And it is kind of daily, and Wilkerson details many, many instances of this kind of daily sort of disregard for boundaries, right, that are made permissible because of one's position as part of the subordinate caste. She says, caste is the granting or withholding of respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefit of the doubt, and human kindness to someone on the basis of their perceived rank or status in the hierarchy. So, there are many, many instances in the news that we could point to, but the one that I thought would be pretty emblematic to share is the case of Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper, and this in this Central Park bird watching scenario. So hopefully technology will be on my side.
It's because so they won't.
It's actually so that like if somebody clears their throat,
We use like I'm
then they're
sorry.
not shown to
You
Stop.
please.
that their microphone is on, they're unmuted. when that happens, if somebody makes a little noise, all of a sudden their picture shows up on there.
Oh,
We're not on.
We're having technical problems with the voices, but I think we've all seen this and kind of know exactly where you're
Yeah.
going.
Okay.
Okay. So in this moment, right, and I was sort of waiting for the moment where she calls the police, but we, you know, we see the operations of caste, right? So what happens here is that the incident occurs because it's tacitly agreed upon roles have been transgressed. A Black man has called a white woman out for not following the rules. In other words, he has passed his place. Because of her membership in the privileged caste by virtue of her race, she weaponizes her cell phone, her status, and the police to put him back in his place. She is operating inside of prescribed caste rules, which grant her respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefit of the doubt, and human kindness on the basis of her perceived rank or standing in the hierarchy, and ostensibly denies him those same options. Caste, therefore, Wilkerson writes, is insidious and therefore powerful because it's not hatred, it's not necessarily personal, right? So in that instance, it's not that Amy Cooper decided that she, you know, just sort of hated all Black people and hated all Black men. It was this sort of silent, invisibilized, internalized privilege granted her, accorded her, and not granted him that you know, sort of helps to create the framing for this particular moment and many others like it. And we could read many other instances through this sort of alembic. So Wilkerson then continues that caste then lives, right? And caste lives in the assumptions that we make about who should be in which role or not, right? The backhanded compliments. You're so articulate. The unspoken comment is based on assumptions about people who look how you look or carry themselves. In other words, I didn't expect you to be so, and you could fill in the blanks, articulate. I didn't expect you to be so rich. I didn't expect you to be so educated, and so on. In the tentacles of caste, which is how, you know, when Wilkerson sort of really lays out like how this becomes operationalized, right? How African Americans live and contend with the tentacles of caste. She talks about the daily surveillance, right, of Black citizens. The assumption of guilt in a country in which, right, there is the foundation of our legal system is the assumption, you know, innocent until proven guilty. For African Americans, the assumption, and caste creates this, is the assumption of guilt. The absence of the burden of proof, the absence of generosity, of being given the benefit of the doubt. And so how then to imagine an end to caste? For Wilkerson, it begins with what she calls radicality, putting in the work to educate oneself and to listen with a humble heart, to understand another's experience from their perspective. Radical empathy is not about you, it is the ability to perhaps live a little while in the other person's skin and bones. So where she ends is with the assumption that we all have a responsibility to, as she puts it, you know, we all have to assume responsibility, as she puts it, for the good or ill of what we do today. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Russell, for enlightening us on that. And you talked a little bit about the, I mean, you shared a lot of perspectives, but you did mention something about commerce and business. And one fact, before I introduce our next panelist, one fact I want to share with you all, we are a chamber of commerce, and some skeptics may say, but why are you guys talking about Caste, a book on caste and racism? Well, commerce is important and African Americans, people of color, are very much a part of commerce in South Florida. Let me just share this with you. Black South Florida's population is approximately 1.2 million. We represent roughly 18% of Miami-Dade, 30% of Broward, and 20% of Palm Beach. That's a lot of business that can pass through the African American community, the people of color. So if you're a business person, if you're a member of the chamber, certainly you need to understand caste and this whole power dynamic to understand how to do business with people who don't look like you. So let's move on to our next speaker, who I'm really excited about. And he comes from really the other side of the world, from India. Atul Kosia is the Senior Vice President and Global Head of Talent, Learning, and Organization Effectiveness at Mondelez International and is based in Chicago, Illinois. He is a global human resources leader with a proven track record in organization development, talent management, capacity building, change leadership, and mergers and acquisitions. He grew up in India, starting his career as an industrial relations executive in a local tractor manufacturing plant. His early exposure to diversity and human interactions shaped his thinking and perspective on humanity and leadership. His previous assignments included HR leadership roles in diverse multicultural environments, including Asia Pacific, Europe, Middle East, and Africa with PepsiCo, Novartis, and Mondelez International. With no further ado, Atul, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks very much, Andre. And it's my privilege and pleasure to be in this conversation. First, a big thanks to Eva Diaz, my friend who introduced me to Jerry and Andre. And thanks to you, Jerry, Andre, giving me this opportunity to not only participate in this, which obviously I'm looking forward to, but just be in this conversation. And it was, for me, absolutely transformative experience. Of course, reading the book, but Heather, listening to you, and the way you unfolded and brought the context to life. I want to start with a little bit of my own background and story. And I want to really focus on one aspect of the book. So obviously, the way when I was reading and reflecting on Amy's work, I was connecting the dots with my personal experiences in terms of my own journey through my childhood in India. And then 20 years back when I moved out of India and lived and worked in different parts of the world, how I experienced segregation or exclusion in a way. And I today sit in a very consequential role in a large organization with 70,000 people. And one of my focus areas is how do you make organizations more inclusive? Especially global organizations, which are basically catering to or working with a very, very diverse global set of consumers and customers. How do you bring that mindset of humanity into operating the businesses? So I want to talk a little bit about that. So first, my own childhood. So I grew up in northern part of India. Those of you who are familiar with India, it's like 300 miles north of Delhi. And my dad was a lawyer, and my life was great till the age of 11 when I lost my father. So my mom at that time decided, we were in a relatively small town in northern part of India, and my mother decided to move with two young children, an older boy of 13 and me at 11, to a larger town so that we can get access to some good education in India. And I'm talking about mid-70s and late 70s. It was not a very conducive environment for a single woman to bring up children in a new city, large city, where she had no roots, no connections, but only desire to provide the right opportunities for her children. And while I had listened to, and as a child, a lot of stories on casteism from my mother as I was growing up, I had not firsthand felt any kind of exclusion in the first 8 or 10 years or 11 years of my life. And I remember moving to this large town where there were folks, all so-called well-wishers, who had already started segmenting our lives in a way what we can and cannot do. So I was put in a school, which was a charity-run local language school, because they felt I'm coming from a smaller town and I'll not be able to go to an English-speaking environment. I will not be able to sustain. So my education, which came from a good school, moved on to a system where I had to really stretch and work hard to learn and grow from that experience. And I think growing through those years and making our own choices and decisions, and then being more aware of how the broader society operates, kind of shaped a lot of my thinking. And today, when I'm leading talent for a global company, a lot of that has an influence in how we shape our strategy and agenda. So Heather actually covered a lot of very pertinent aspects of the book, and I want to really focus on one of those which really stuck with me, and which is, when Wilkerson said, an honest accounting of current condition won't be accomplished if its citizens are not willing to confront the consequences of its history. And when I was reading that, I started reflecting on this particular aspect of why we shy away from confronting the truth before we really start to address any of these deep-rooted issues. And two examples I wanted to share with the audience today. One is coming from the India caste system, which is very broadly and widely quoted by Amy in the book. And she refers to this word called Dalit, which is the lowest of the varnas or the castes in India, which means oppressed. And in the late 19th century, this word was, by the way, coined by a gentleman called Jyotiba Phule. He was a social reformist in the late 19th century in India. And Dalit, if you translate in English, means oppressed. And he introduced this term Dalit to qualify or call out people who were actually not given their due place in the society. And his entire idea was to highlight the plight before we could even resolve or start addressing that problem. And in 1920s, Gandhi, when he returned to India from South Africa, he felt extremely uncomfortable, to the extent even ashamed of the fact that in India, there was this level of segregation and this level of classification, which drove this exclusionary mindset. He introduced this term. So first, he professed that we should not be calling the lowest caste as Dalits or oppressed, and we should be calling them as Harijans. So when I grew up, nobody could call people in the schools or anywhere a particular caste as Dalits. The government direction was we should call those Harijans. Harijan in English, if I translate, literal meaning is children of God. And to my mind, to some extent, this just took away the focus on the real problem. So just calling. And Gandhi, by the way, did a lot of visual and visible, put in place those actions, which would give a broader message to the society that there is no differentiation or no segregation. He would go live with them. He would go sleep in their houses, eat their food. And this entire concept of untouchability or intouchability, he would go against that just to give people a visual signal. And he was a highly respected leader. But to my mind, that never addressed the issue. The issue was so deep-rooted, it stayed in the country. Till Ambedkar came back. Ambedkar is the creator of Constitution in India. When he was writing Constitution, he deliberately decided not to put word Harijan in the Constitution, and he reintroduced the word Dalit. And his concept was that till the time we really identify the problem and understand and agree that there is a problem, we can't even find a solution. And the the word was reintroduced into the Constitution of India. And that's when, the social upliftment or mobility with the reservations in the government jobs, in the education institutions and all that started, because first they took a step back to identify that there's a problem. And that's something which again stuck with me, especially as I kind of moved through the world, living in Singapore, Switzerland, in the US now. And I lived 4 years in Atlanta, Andre, from 2008 to 2012. One of the things which really stuck with me is that here, our desire to jump into the solution very quickly. So whenever there is an aggravation or there is a visual reflection of the issue, 7-8 months back, this movement around Black Lives Matter, how many companies are corporates are very quickly jumping into creating solutions to improve social representation or racial representation in their organization. So there are metrics being put in place, a very quick fix actions being put in place, a new DEI function being created, or the position of a D&I officer being elevated to the executive level. Very, very quick movement to ensure that we address the problem. And it's all well-meaning, but to my mind, without reflecting on it, without understanding what is causing this issue, why we are there, why organizations are at a point today where you have to even think about, I got to create a level playing field or an inclusionary environment. Without having a conversation on that, we are very quickly going and committing. I see CEOs going public, making statements like, I want to improve my, Black representation in our leadership by 5% or by 10% by so-and-so timeline, which actually pains me. And it takes me back to this conversation I was having about Gandhi and Ambedkar, that we are trying to run away from the issue without really going deeper into understanding why we cannot create a level playing field. What is causing this? What is holding us back to create an inclusionary, all-inclusive kind of environment where everybody, independent of their color, their background, their caste, can thrive and work? And there's a history which tells us as you read this book. And I can tell you, for me, it was a huge kind of knowledge generation. I just got hooked on because I was reliving a lot of this, connecting the dots and seeing why this is so relevant. So I'm a big believer in, as Andre mentioned, about bringing back humanity in leadership. And I truly believe today in the desire to compete and win in every situation. By the time people reach the leadership ladder, they are more opportunistic, looking at how can I win, how can I make my next level or make my next million, forgetting about a basic humanity. How do you treat others? How do you feel about what you're doing? How do you bring everybody together with you? So I'm a big believer in bringing humanity back in leadership, making sure that leaders are looking at every other person as human being. Towards the end of the book, when Wilkerson talks about building that connection with a plumber, which is a human connection, which gives her hope that things can improve and can be better, is something which I truly believe is something to reflect upon and see where we can make those changes. So I'm so curious to listen to and hear other perspectives, but happy to address any questions as we go along. So back to you, Andre.
Thank you so much, Atul. And now I'm well traveled. I've not ventured as far as India, but I think that, you offer an incredible perspective, because we think about racism and caste, we live in the United States and we think about it in the Americas, but obviously caste can rear its ugly head all over the planet, all over the world. So that's a great perspective. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Andre?
Yes, sir.
This might be an appropriate time for me to ask Atul a question.
Sure.
Because he just finished talking about this. And, we spoke at length before you signed on. And you told me you grew up in India. And I just wonder, in the book, Isabel talks about that Indians are accepting of their designated position in caste. So whether they were Dalit or whatever the highest, are, that somehow in India, everyone, according to her, accepts their level and they're happy about it. They don't strive to exceed. They don't strive to move up, if you will. And I'm wondering if you can just comment on that. You touched on it a little bit in your own experience. Did you find that that was true, that people were accepting, and yet how did they transform, or is the country still in that vein?
It's a great question, Jerry, and it is true actually. By and large, I won't say in every situation, but by and large, there is this broader acceptance of the system or the coding of the caste in India, and which goes by the way, it's not binary unlike in the US. Binary, I'm probably using a very specific term, but in India, you have a massive religious distribution. You have a caste, then you have languages, then you have color, then you have geographies where you're South Indian or you're North Indian, etc. So there is this myriad of classifications which exist. Two, the system is the varnas, or the caste system is very deeply embedded into religion. So the Vedas, which are the religious books apparently written thousands of years back, have classified the jobs, the roles, the connections, and it goes very deep. And it's almost understood as a fate. So it's a God's will that you are born in a certain caste, and people accept it. So now the manifestation of that, I'll give you a real or simple example is, I go back home to India. So I see a big house with the family living in that house of probably 3 or 4 people, which is catered to or supported by a team of drivers and servants and enablers who live in the same house in a smaller back kind of quarters in that house. And there is kind of a harmony in certain ways in that environment where, I see, by the way, cash lying on the table, but no, they know that this is a generations of people who have been living with me, who will not, I can trust. So there is this inherent kind of mindset of this is the will of the God. And that helps keep that whatever balance which exists there. But not that there is no unrest. There are pockets when it goes to its extremes. We have issues all the time where there are reactions, and there is, there is a government kind of proposed restrictions in some of the rural areas where you can't do stuff which you're doing in the larger towns. So yes, to your question, there is still a semblance of, or a part of that which takes place in the country.
It was very interesting, Andre, I'll turn it back to you, but it's very interesting that I just recently saw the movie White Tiger. And it was, for those of you who haven't seen it, it was about just what you're talking about, someone who was a driver in a family, but it boiled over. He finally had enough, and he said, I'm getting out of here. And he kills the wealthy guy, and he steals a couple $1 million. So it certainly boiled over. Andre, back to you.
Sure, and thank you for the question, Jared. Yeah, and I know some other folks have questions. Jared's one of my bosses, so I had to take his question, folks. But we'll get to your questions a little bit later, okay? Arathi, I see your hand up. Now we're about to move the discussion into, I think, an area that, based on the chat room, a lot of you all will be very interested in talking about. Both these gentlemen are of Jewish descent. Now, most of you all who read the book, Wilkerson compares the Jim Crow system, legal subjugation of Black folks in United States, compares it to Nazism in Germany. And as a matter of fact, and I was surprised to learn this, the Nuremberg laws and the Nazi system of atrocities and really legal atrocities against Jews was based on the United States Jim Crow laws in the South. And the Nazis even said that our laws were additionally, they were too stringent, and they could never model their laws after the Jim Crow laws in the South. That was very eye-opening. But let me introduce our next panelist. Joshua Sales has served as the Director of Jewish Community Relations and Government Affairs for the Greater Miami Jewish Federation since October 2020. In this role, he advocates for policies and funding critical to the Miami-Dade Jewish community, with a specific focus on combating anti-Semitism and supporting Israel. He also builds broad coalitions with diverse community partners to address local issues and strengthen Miami-Dade as a whole. Prior to Joshua's role in Miami, he served as Director of Community Relations for the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh, where notably he served on their crisis management team in response to the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue. And I don't know if you all remember about the murders of the Jewish families in the synagogue some years ago. He's a journalist by trade. Josh holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Washington University in St. Louis. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Andre, and thank you to the Chamber for extending this invitation. I'm going to start by sharing reading a passage that stood out to me in the book more than any other, and there were so many passages, but this one in particular. Quote, "Is it possible that any of my slaves could go to heaven?" A dominant caste woman in South Carolina asked her minister. "And must I see them there?" A century after the slaveholders spoke those words, the caste system had survived and mutated, its pillars intact. America was fighting World War II, and the public school district in Columbus, Ohio, decided to hold an essay contest challenging students to consider the question, what to do with Hitler after the war. It was the spring of 1944, the same year that a Black boy was forced to jump to his death in front of his stricken father over the Christmas card the boy had sent to a white girl at work. In that atmosphere, the 16-year-old African-American girl thought about what should befall Hitler. She won the student essay contest with a single sentence. Quote, "Put him in a black skin and let him live the rest of his life in America." Unquote. So what I appreciated most about this book is that it gives me the language to talk about what I already knew was happening in America, but wasn't able to put into words. And as a Jewish representative on this panel, and having witnessed and experienced horrible anti-Semitism in my lifetime, I want to focus my remarks on that space, but I want to react to a couple of pieces in the book first. It's amazing to me the extent that the Germans used the caste system as a model to persecute the Jewish people in Germany. And it shines a whole new light on American ingenuity. In the summer of 2018, I took a trip to Germany to learn about the Holocaust, and I saw the Holocaust Memorials in Berlin and all over Germany. And what Ms. Wilkerson claims about the Germans and the Holocaust versus Americans and slavery and the Confederacy is unquestionably true. And I saw a little bit in the chat, people were talking about this as well. The Germans do a much better job reconciling with their past than we do as Americans. And while I was in Berlin, my group took a bus to Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp that's also mentioned in the book, and it's about an hour or so south of Berlin. And the day I was there, it was August, and it was 98 degrees outside, the hottest day on record in Berlin in 150 years. And three things stood out to me for the 3 hours that I was there. The lack of shade, the lack of a place to sit, and despite the fact that I was hot and miserable like everybody else, unlike my ancestors, every individual step I chose to take there, and every individual thing I chose to do was of my own free will, all the way down to the singular sips of water that I was taking from my water bottle that I was carrying around with me. So it was with great intention when I chose to leave my group and to exercise my personal freedoms and to wander around the grounds of my home. And less than a year later, in the spring of 2019, I took a 3-day civil rights tour of the South. And in a group of 50 or so, I was accompanied by 4 friends, 2 young Jewish professionals and 2 young Black professionals from Pittsburgh, where I was living at the time. And we saw some of the most important civil rights in Atlanta, in Montgomery, in Selma, and Birmingham. And when we toured the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is also known as the Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, I was astounded by the eerie similarities that I had felt as when I was walking through the Holocaust Memorial in Germany less than a year prior. And after we visited the memorial, we got on a bus and we went to a museum in downtown Montgomery, and on our way, as our bus was rounding through a traffic circle, our tour guide pointed out that this was the place where slave auctions were held. And right nearby was a public transit bus stop. And I can't even imagine what it must feel like for a Black person who lives in Montgomery and who works nearby that slave auction block or that bus stop, to take the bus to work every day and to have to integrate that area into a regular part of their life even today. And when we talk about the difference between Americans and Germans, and when we talk about how Germany is littered with memorials and tributes and acknowledgements about the Holocaust, that's not to say that there aren't plenty of neo-Nazis there too. But again, I really want to emphasize that the Germans are light years ahead of where we are as Americans. I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to talk about three things. And I'm going to kind of move to more current day. I want to touch on the George Floyd murder, and I want to touch on mass shootings targeting Jewish people. And I want to close by offering perspective on when anti-Israel activity can cross the line into anti-Semitism. If there was no caste system in America, you could argue that George Floyd would still be alive. You could also argue that with no caste system, if George Floyd still if George Floyd still was murdered, he would have been mourned for being George Floyd as a person, and not simply because he's another Black man in America who fell victim to the caste system in one of the most extreme ways. What the majority of Americans don't understand is that the anger, and especially the anger that the Black community feels over George Floyd, is not actually about George Floyd. He's a symbol, he's an example of what can happen to someone in America at a whim simply for being Black. We can have the same conversation about the mass shooting that took place at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. With the Jewish community, it's the same conversation with the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, or Chabad of Poway, the shooting there just outside of San Diego. It's not that those people were killed, it's that they could have been any one of us. It could have been any member of the Black community, it could have been any member of the Jewish community. And perhaps the saddest part, go back to George Floyd as an example, is that nobody had the opportunity to mourn George Floyd simply for being George Floyd. And there are thousands of people just like him. I mentioned I was going to talk about when anti-Israel activity crosses the line into anti-Semitism. How could that possibly come into play in a conversation like this? Well, Ms. Wilkerson discusses three caste systems, and she focuses on the United States, and she weaves in narratives about Germany and India. And Andre, you even mentioned, as you were talking, that there are caste systems in many countries. I would argue that there are caste systems, there are a form of hereditary hierarchies in most countries around the world. And I sat down earlier this afternoon and I rattled off a list, and this took me 60 seconds just to scribble down. And I came up with, in 60 seconds, United States, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, France, China, Australia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Rwanda. I actually even heard a story on NPR a few weeks ago about how there was a modern day caste system in a Western African country between lower caste families who had their family members kidnapped into slavery and shipped to America, and the dominant caste members of those families who actually helped the slave traders capture those people. Forgive me for not being able to recall the country. I was in and out of my car running errands, but I was fascinated by this. And some of you, I'm sure, are thinking, you're leaving some countries out, and I am. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of these countries that have caste systems. Israel has a caste system too. And I'm not dismissing the issues in Israel or in any caste system, but I want to be abundantly clear, because this ties into anti-Semitism that we see around the world. Israel is far from the worst transgressor in caste systems. It's not China with the Uyghur Muslims. It's not Myanmar with the Rohingya population. It's not Nazi Germany. It's not the Rwandan genocide. It's not South African apartheid. It's not Cambodia and its assault on intellectualism. It's not the United States. And yet Israel is the only country in the world who, when people protest its caste system, they use tactics, including the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and other anti-normalization movements in an outward effort to end its existence as a Jewish state. And there's no other country in the world that we've protested, for whatever reason, whether you talk about apartheid South Africa or Nazi Germany or communist Cuba, where we've ever said you don't have the right to be a country, you don't have the right to exist. And caste is a horrible thing, and it shouldn't exist anywhere. But of all of these dozens and dozens and dozens of caste systems in the world, why is the singular caste system in the world where Jewish people are at the top of the caste, why is that the only country in the world where people routinely argue that that country shouldn't be on the map? And I think it's an easy answer, because people are trying to restore the natural order to the world. And the natural order is the one when Jewish people are usually at or near the bottom, and of course, never at the top. And I'll stop there.
Josh, that was very powerful, and yeah, the chat room was lit up before you were speaking, even more so now. And I know you do. I know the Jewish Federation very well. I know the CRC very well, and I know you do a lot of. You support Israel, but you also do a lot of work to support greater relationships between the Black community and the Jewish community, and I really appreciate that, because I think we have more in common than not. And just by way of example, I've been involved with AIPAC in the past. In fact, they sent me to Israel as a part of a political tour of Israel in the past. And just so everyone knows, Israel is the only country outside of the United States that recognizes the birth date of Martin Luther King Jr. So for any African Americans on the call, that's very powerful. So Josh, thank you for sharing your perspective. Really appreciate that. Our next panelist is Professor Orrin Baruch Steer, PhD. He is director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program and professor of Religious Studies at Florida International University, where he also directs the Jewish Studies Certificate Program. He is the author of Holocaust Icons, Symbolizing the Shoah in History and Memory, published in 2015, and Committed to Memory, Cultural Mediations of the Holocaust, published in 2003, and co-editor of Religion, Violence, Memory, and Place, published in 2006. He has been a Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and was the great curator for an exhibition on race and visual culture under National Socialism at the Wolfsonian Teaching Gallery at FIU's Frost Art Museum in 2013. He has served as co-chair of the Religion, Holocaust, and Genocide Group of the American Academy of Religion, and recently served as an expert on an expert group creating new Holocaust education standards for the state of Florida. Professor Steer, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Andre, for inviting me to participate in this panel. And thank you to all my co-panelists. Special shout out to Dean Russell for putting us together. I appreciate it. And also it's nice to see old friend Robin Jacobs here on in this session. I want to thank you for the opportunity to reflect on this jam-packed book. I will try to keep my remarks somewhat brief because we want to have some time for questions. I'm coming at this as a scholar of the Holocaust, and so I read with great interest Ms. Wilkerson's assessments and characterizations of Nazi Germany as a rapidly constructed caste system deliberately based in part on the American experience, as has been pointed out already. Indeed, I was just discussing with my students yesterday America's infatuation with eugenics in the first decades of the 20th century, and how the Nazis learned from and indeed adopted a number of America's principles for their own sterilization and euthanasia policies. So the Nazi system presents instructive parallels to the American caste system of over 400 years and counting. And this is one of the things that made the book so powerful and so relevant for me. I'm particularly interested in the ways the book reveals how the infrastructures of caste are coupled with long-standing, deep-seated prejudices and fears of the other. In the case of Nazi Germany, over 2,000 years of anti-Semitism, and how they're coupled with more recently created legal mechanisms designed to delegitimize people, as seen, for example, in the Nuremberg laws of 1935 and other judicial measures like them in the first 6 years or so of what scholars call the era of caper violence of the Nazi regime. And so I'm interested then in how these structures, these fears, these mechanisms together reinforce each other and create racial stereotypes. They actually create the concept of race itself, as Wilkerson has shown. And then they perpetuate and even justify social views of the subordinate caste as embodying the very same negative characteristics the dominant society has created for and projected onto them. In other words, in the German case, the Nazis made Jews into a subordinate caste, and then in dispossessing them of their livelihoods, their property, their citizenship, and more, eventually sending many of them to crowded and unsanitary ghettos, they created the public image of the filthy Jew for which they themselves were responsible. And Wilkerson shows exactly the same thing happening in all caste systems, and especially in the American case. Here, I'm reminded of a remarkable documentary I use in another class of mine called A Film Unfinished by the Israeli director Yael Hersansky, which recounts the discovery of lost footage the Nazis had recorded in the Warsaw Ghetto that reveals that material scholars had thought for years showed some very disturbing images. We see in these classic images, filmed images of the Warsaw Ghetto, we see these disturbing images of class segregated behavior. Jews in the ghetto, apparently wealthy Jews literally stepping over starving, destitute co-religionists in the street, ignoring their plight. And for many years, scholars looked at this footage and thought, oh, I mean, you know, I guess there were these class differences. I guess that even in the ghetto, there was this stratified society. And it redirected, it misdirected our understanding of the actual situation of the ghetto. And Hersansky discovered this lost footage that showed unequivocally that this footage was actually staged by the Nazis to create the impression that the ghetto was an environment in which Jews had agency, in which Jews had the ability to look after their own, but simply chose not to. And that's part of the insidious mechanism of caste working behind the scenes. This book encouraged me to think comparatively, for example, about the parallel need in the German and American cases to classify, to identify those being subjugated in order to subjugate them. And there are other parallels. There are the parallel euphemisms that I found fascinating, right? I never thought, I'm embarrassed to say, the term plantation, it sounds lovely. Who wouldn't want to live and work on a plantation, right? Which masks the reality of the situation. Compare that to the Nazi euphemisms like labor camps or deportations, work in the East. And because some of my research deals with Holocaust memorials and monuments, I was very interested in Wilkerson's discussion of the more than 1,700 monuments to the Confederacy in the US and I'm quoting here, usually it is the victors of war who erect monuments and commemorations to themselves. Here, an outsider might not be able to tell which side had prevailed over the other, end quote. As an aside, the periodical The Forward recently published the first ever database of monuments to Nazi collaborators and Holocaust perpetrators, listing 320 monuments and street names in 16 countries, including the US, on 3 continents, which represent men and organizations who have enabled and often quite literally implemented the final solution. The vast majority erected in the past 20 years. Not 80 years, in the past 20 years. So Wilkerson rightly and instructively points out that Germany, and this has been out there in the chat already from the first few minutes, Germany does not have a culture and tradition of memorializing its past perpetration of crimes against humanity, and has even criminalized the display of a swastika. And this brings up for us the ongoing debate over what to do with Confederate monuments and Confederate flags that still populate our country. So the book gave me a lot to think and talk about, but I want to conclude with just 2 references. One, reflecting maybe a more pessimistic nature. The book made me think of the philosopher Avishai Margalit, who discusses the tension between thin relations and thick relations. And he laments what he sees as the problem of the thin relations, the thin bonds of common humanity, never quite being enough to be stronger than the thick bonds and the thick relations of community, tribe, and nation. And in this, I'll also add caste. And that's a pretty pessimistic view. But I try to be optimistic, and I'm heartened, therefore, by the stories Wilkerson quotes near the end about Albert Einstein, one of my childhood heroes, though I never knew the extent of his heroism in standing up on behalf of others to the humiliations of caste. And this was something that gave me small hope in reading this book, that the world is not completely unredeemable. So I'll turn the spotlight back over, and I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you, Professor. Very enlightening words, and really appreciate your perspective. Our last panelist, and last but certainly not least, and I think she's going to talk a little bit about social responsibility, and probably help us organize our thoughts around a lot of what we've heard today. Courtney Berrien is the Associate Director of the Center for Community Service Initiatives at Barry University and co-chair at Barry University's Anti-Racism and Equity Coalition. I want to thank my friend, Professor Sean Foreman, for introducing me to her. He's the head of the history department at Barry. She also serves as co-chair for the Miami-Dade County Truth, Reconciliation, and Education Initiative, the project that memorializes incidents of racial terror and is conducted in partnership with the Montgomery-based Equal Justice Initiative. As a PhD student in the University of Miami's Community Wellbeing Program, she studies truth and reconciliation processes around race in the United States. Prior to working in higher education, she served as DE&I, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Facilitator, and Program Director at MCCJ, historically known as the Miami Coalition of Christians and Jews. Her perspective is informed by the 10 years she spent teaching history and coordinating community engagement programs for the International Baccalaureate school system, living and working in Lebanon, the Czech Republic, and Egypt. She holds degrees in history and education from the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. Courtney, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you to the panelists. This is such an important conversation to have right now, and I'm really honored to be part of it. I'm going to use a PowerPoint to go through my points today, partly because there's a lot that I want to talk about and I have a really short period of time to do it. So I'm hoping that this will keep me on track. All right, so I'd like to agree with Professor Russell. I think that Wilkerson's book is really paradigm shifting and helping us understand race in the United States. And with that, I'd like to start by reading from the second chapter of her book. She uses metaphors throughout to really talk about the need to address race in the United States, but I think that this one in particular is very powerful. So America is an old house. We can never declare the work is over. Wind, flood, drought, and human upheavals batter a structure that is already fighting whatever flaws were left unattended in the original foundation. When you live in an old house, you may not want to go into the basement after a storm to see what the rains have wrought. Choose not to look, however, at your own peril. The owner of an old house knows that whatever you are ignoring will never go away. Whatever is lurking will fester, whether you choose to look or not. Ignorance is no protection from the consequences of inaction. Whatever you are wishing away will gnaw at you until you gather the courage to face what you would rather not see. We in the developed world are like homeowners who inherited a house on a piece of land that is beautiful on the outside, but whose soil is unstable loam and rock, heaving and contracting over generations, cracks patched, but the deeper ruptures waved away for decades, centuries even. Many people may rightfully say, I had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people, never owned slaves. And yes, no one of us here was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now. And any further deterioration is in fact on our hands. So for me, this passage was especially powerful because Wilkerson is really bringing up four main points that I think are misunderstood in our society. And so I would like to focus my remarks on these. So the first is that the rules of race are structural. The second is that it's in our collective interest to tend to matters of race. The third, addressing race is not about blame, it's about accountability. And finally, matters of race must be confronted or they will fester and grow. So let's start with this first one. The rules of race are structural. So I want to begin by talking about misunderstandings about the term racism itself. A lot of us think of explicit racism when we talk about racism, but for those that study racism, they're often talking about implicit racism. And so when we think about explicit racism, there's a stereotype that often comes to mind. The KKK probably holds that stereotype most closely. But it's this idea of a repugnant white male, probably from a southern state, maybe from before the civil rights movement, possibly after that, who is vehement in their racist ideologies. And we know that those people still live in our country and there are people that hold those views. These are people who outwardly would say that white people are a superior race to Black people. And they typically also, of course, hold anti-Semitic ideas as well. But often where I think we get stuck as a society as we're talking about race is once you engage in conversations about race, we're really moving far beyond the explicit conversation to look at implicit racism. And it's implicit racism that can really do a lot of damage in our society. So this photograph that you see is a photograph from a film called Birth of a Nation. A lot of us probably know about this film. It's a little over 100 years old now. And even in this case, when we think about Birth of a Nation, we think about it being an example of a time period that has passed, a racist time period that has passed. But yet, if you look at this photograph, you see something that's still alive and well in our culture today. This idea of white normalcy, of white innocence, of white purity. And it's the overexposure over time, similarly to what Professor Russell was talking about before, to these aspects of our culture that have implicit, almost subliminal suggestions that to be a normal American is to be a white American. And these are the ideas that a lot of people want to unpack when they're talking about implicit racism. So the next thing that I think that is commonly misunderstood when we're talking about racism is that racism operates on different levels. Again, when we talk about racism, people tend to think of the stereotype of a racist person that is very vehement in their ideologies. And people have a reaction to that, right? Almost everyone in the United States would probably say, I'm not racist. I do not hold those beliefs. But what we're really talking about there is not racism. We're really talking about prejudice, right? The idea that you have preconceived notions against another group. And when you start to act on those, a lot of people would use a definition of racism that says prejudice is putting racism into action. And that can be done on an individual level. It can be done on a relational level. But again, when we're talking about the impact of racism, where racism really starts to make our society a place that's not healthy and inclusive for all people, we're usually talking about institutional racism and systemic and structural racism. And these are difficult to see, but this is where the power is. And I think what Wilkerson does such a great job of is she illustrates story after story of how this embedded, implicit racism is a part of our institutions and it's a part of our broader society. And that's what makes it all the more difficult to tackle. Just looking at some of the comments in the chat, we often talk past each other when we're trying to talk about race. And I think that's a little bit of what's going on. Some people are holding to this notion that racism is an idea of prejudice. And they'll say, well, I'm not racist. I believe in equality. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to interrogate and examine the structures in our society that lead to inequality. So a lot of DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, probably a lot of you have gone through these types of trainings, will help to show those relationships, right, between implicit bias, structural racism, and ultimately these things are manifested in our policies and practices. And of course, they're historic, right? They're contextually based. They're not ideas that are derived for the sake of a public argument, but they're based in real history that needs to be understood, and how that history impacts our society needs to be understood. So the next point, it's in our collective interest to tend to matters of race. So something that we know, all kinds of social scientists, epidemiologists, academics study the effects that inequality have on societies. And we know that the United States performs poorly when compared to other developed nations pretty frequently on such matters as happiness, health outcomes, the education gap, digital divide. These things also, by the way, are big problems in Miami, right? That a lot of us that are involved in the community are trying to address in Miami. And since I only was supposed to talk for 5 minutes today, I'm not going to unpack each of these, but the fundamental truth here is that we know, and the pandemic probably illustrates this the best, we know that there is inequity in this country and that there are negative outcomes because of that. And the fact that we're afraid to address race, according to Wilkerson, and I agree with her, means that this will be perpetuated. So the third point here is that addressing race is not about blame. It's about accountability. So too often we avoid conversations about race because we're told that it's a blame game, for white people in particular, right? They don't want to go to racial dialogue. They're going to feel guilty. They're going to be told everything that's their fault, but they're just trying, to be people that aren't enacting prejudice. And so again, this is where we can get stuck. But what Wilkerson is really saying is that none of us have created this racial system, but we're all swimming in it, right? This is the water that surrounds us. It doesn't matter if you came to the United States like my family did more than 200 years ago. It doesn't matter if you came yesterday. We all arrive, and this is the social milieu, right? This is how we navigate society. And it's up to us, really, if we care about these issues, to take a hard look internally at our own positionality, to have a better idea of how we navigate these issues. You know, what does it mean for me to be a white woman walking down the street? What might it mean for my Black colleague to be walking down the street? That's part of the process here. And it's also about not asking just questions about fault, right? These are historic questions for the most part. There are certainly modern people who continue to perpetrate some of the systemic injustices, but those conversations usually don't go very far. It's about being willing to see the racialized landscape and understanding how that affects the health of our community. And again, a lot of this has to do with understanding history. And there's a lot of debate in the chat, even about history, right? So this brings me to my final point here. Matters of race must be confronted or they will fester and grow. And if you watch interviews with Wilkerson, that's why she wrote the book, right? This is why this is an important matter. I don't think any of us want to live in a society that is an unequal one. But I want to talk about why particularly this is important when we're talking about health of a community. So there's a growing body of research that addresses the notion of why confronting race is important. And a lot of that research right now is looking at collective trauma. So collective trauma is a concept that is rooted a lot actually in Holocaust studies, but looks at populations of people who have experienced collective violence. And here when we're talking about violence, we're talking about physical violence, but other forms of violence as well, including symbolic violence. And what some research suggests, growing research suggests, that a way of committing trauma against a group of people is to delegitimize their experience. And if you have an accumulated delegitimizing processes, which is also propagated by narratives in our society that gloss over or entirely omit instances of racial violence, we can see direct connections to things like stress, mental illness, things that lead to those inequitable health outcomes that we're seeing so clearly right now. And of course, the dominant narratives that are oppressing these experiences of trauma are reinforced by our culture and our schooling. And specifically in the United States, we talk about a narrative that suggests that everyone has an equal opportunity, right? We say, everyone here, you know, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, there's no problem, go forth. That in itself, the propagation of that narrative in itself is a form of symbolic violence that can be harmful to people of color in this country. So that leads us to truth and reconciliation processes. And again, what Wilkerson does is she talks about what happens in Germany. She compares that to the United States. But if you look at truth and reconciliation processes around the world, Josh talked about things that have happened in Rwanda, Chile, but going back even to the Nuremberg trials, what these processes have in common is that all of them, sure, there's a truth-telling component to it, but they're building a new narrative. So they're interrogating the former narrative that's dominant, and they're replacing it with a narrative that is more truthful, more inclusive, and is honest about the experiences of the folks who have experienced the trauma. And so that leads me to talk about the Equal Justice Initiative project, which has been mentioned a couple of times, and Wilkerson also mentions it in her book. So what you see here is a part of the memorial to peace and justice that's in Montgomery. And those pillars that you see hanging above you have text engraved on the bottom. If you haven't had a chance to go to Montgomery, it's hard right now, it's the pandemic, but this is outside. This is a really transformational experience for folks in the United States. On the bottom of these pillars are the names of counties. And there are 800 pillars within the memorial, one for each of the counties where the Equal Justice Initiative has documented cases of racial lynchings in the United States. And when we hear about racial lynchings, we often think of it being extra legal, people going out off on their own, committing some violence, but that is not really the reality. In most cases, these instances of lynchings, especially the ones that we know about, were publicized ahead of time as an advertisement in papers. They were committed on the steps of courthouses and public squares, treated as picnics where the community came out with children to watch them. This is a history that's not very well known in our country. And if you think about the intimidation and violence that the Black community has had to experience by being aware of that history themselves, but having that history be denied in public, again, that's one of the things that leads to the inequities in our society that we see in terms of health outcomes and other things. So these pillars, again, they have the name of a county on the bottom of them. And there is a pillar for Miami-Dade County. There are 3 individuals whose lynchings were documented here in Miami-Dade County. And very few of us could probably tell you their names. You see them here on the screen, or the circumstances behind how they were killed. And the fact that we don't know that, the fact that there isn't a place in Miami where you can go and see this, is testament to what we're talking about in terms of Germany doing a better job than the United States of memorializing the acts of terror perpetrated against citizens that have taken place. So I just want to point out that there is a group here in Miami-Dade County that is trying to do this. I'm part of this group. If folks later in the discussion or through the chat would like to learn more about it, I'd be happy to tell you. There's also a new center here in Miami for racial justice that seeks to memorialize the incidences of racial terror that took place in Florida. Florida, by the way, is the state that has the largest per capita number of racial lynchings in the United States.
Wow.
So I'm going to leave it there. I know I went past my time, but happy to talk about this more. And again, if you'd like to know more about the TIER initiative or the new McDuffie Center for Racial Justice, drop it in the chat or maybe through email. We'd love to give you more information about that. So thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. And this was eye-opening. I didn't know that Miami-Dade County had such a history of racial terror, and the lynchings certainly speak to that. So I want to thank all of our panelists. And I've gotten to know all of you all personally, because we obviously had discussions about your talking points for this panel discussion. So I really appreciate your honesty and your perspectives, and I think everyone enjoyed that. Now we're going to go into our question and answer phase. My co-chair of DNI, Ava Diaz, and the president and CEO of the chamber are going to add Jerry Libben. I'm going to ask some questions, but before I do, Susan Harper is in the room. She's the Consul General of Canada. I guess she wasn't on board when I first introduced her. Susan, are you there?
Can we unmute Susan? Let me see, where is she?
Oh, there. I've finally been
There
unmuted.
Susan, are you there?
Yes, she
I
is.
am. Can you hear me now?
Okay, yes. And Susan, I introduced you. You're the Consul General of Canada in Florida. So for you all who don't know what that means, she's essentially the local ambassador to Canada in the state of Florida. Very well credentialed, been a diplomat for many years. So Susan, I shared that you're a new member of the chamber, and you're committed to DE&I, and you are personally supporting our DE&I Council of the Chamber. Just share a few words with our attendees, please.
Well, thank you. This has been quite an impressive panel discussing a book that I admit I haven't finished reading, but I'm certainly going to. When Deanne suggested I read it, I of course went right out and bought the book if Deanne suggested it, but it's been very impressive, and it's also opened up this opportunity to work with the DEI group at the Miami Beach Chamber. And so thank you for that, Andre. And if this is any indication of the kind of work that this group will be doing. I'm very glad that I'm going to be able to be a part of it. Thank you for that.
Absolutely. And again, this is a Chamber of Commerce, and we're certainly focused on business. So this Caste discussion has certainly created an opportunity to connect with Susan Harper, Counsel General. But let me just share with you some business statistics about Canada. Canada is the overwhelming top international source of tourists coming to Florida, with 3.5 million annual visits and spending almost $5 billion, nearly 40% of all spending by foreign tourists in Florida. So, and with respect to real estate, they're the top foreign purchasers of residential real estate of Florida, with a residential property portfolio around $50 billion. So lots of diversity initiatives to work together on, and maybe we can all also do business with our Canadian brothers and sisters. Okay, thank you so much for joining us, Susan.
Thank you.
So Jerry and Ava, so we're at the Q&A session. So it's your moment in time. I'm sure you guys are just boiling over with questions for our panelists.
Ava, I'll let you go with the first one since I had one already. I have two more.
All right, so thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Jerry because he came up with this idea in the first place for this session today. And obviously, I think, André, you did a beyond awesome job putting together this fantastic panel, and thanking my friend Atul to be here and bring his perspective on the Indian caste and the experience that he can bring in. So when I saw the book has almost 500 pages, I have to confess that I was, oh no, he's not doing this to me. I'm not a big book reader, but I started to read the book and I couldn't stop, to be honest with you. And primarily because I've dealt with DE&I my whole career. I am a professional of human resources, also with a very international career. I mean, I am Brazilian by origin, but I left Brazil 23 years ago, and I lived in Europe, and I traveled the world. Anyway, I am an American now. This is my second citizenship. And I gotta tell you that one thing that always puzzled me, my working for four of the biggest corporations in the world and dealing with this topic, is the question on why is it that despite all the different initiatives and everything that has been done, we haven't yet, at least in my view, moved the needle to at least close to where we all desire. And all of us, I give the example of us here today, you know, all the panelists. So what you brought in was in terms of the common opinion is that we don't want a society that really is marked by inequalities, by racism, by whatever atrocities that we can see. What the book did to me and what resonated to me is that really it's not about the racism. It's not about discrimination. In fact, I think we don't evolve because perhaps we are focusing on the wrong thing, because it is the caste. It is the caste system that really dictates everything that is happening. That's how the conclusion I came up with. So I really want to know from any of our 5 panelists, what do you think about this? What is, some of you already articulated well, but what do you think of my conclusion about this? Courtney, would you like to go? Because thank you so much. I enjoyed all of you, but I really enjoyed your talk as well.
Thank you. And thank you for your question. And I think that the conclusion that you came to is probably one that a lot of folks might come to. What I would say, though, is that I don't think that Wilkerson would say that caste is in any way different from racism. These are all concepts, right? They're framing of how we look at realities in society. And I think that the point that she's making with Caste is that racism is so deeply embedded within our society that we don't even know that it's there. That's my idea about that particular conclusion. In terms of what can we do about it, I think the fact that we don't know the history, right? If we don't know the history of racial violence that has taken place in this country, then what's the problem, right? What are all these people complaining about? So we must know the history, and knowing the history isn't just about reading a book and learning the history. It's about that history being embedded in our public narrative, being legitimized by our government, being legitimized by our school system, and being seen in the community. So the work that we're doing with TEAR, again, TEAR stands for Truth, Education, and Reconciliation here in Miami-Dade County, is to bring these monuments from Montgomery to be erected publicly here, but not just to do that in isolation, to have dialogue around that process, to contribute to the building of curriculum for the school system. People will have a negative response if they hear that the United States is a racist country, if they don't understand the history that took place. So, and again, former history teacher, but to me, that is a fundamental part of the Truth and Reconciliation process. And Brian Stevenson, who founded the Equal Justice Initiative, says so eloquently that this country has never gone through the Truth and Reconciliation process that Germany has gone through. There are 30 nations that have gone through a formal, sanctioned Truth and Reconciliation process that the government or the new regime held. And there are official accounts, official narratives that were a result of that process. In South Africa, there's a Truth and Reconciliation archive. So when you have folks that feel uncomfortable with this history, there's an archive that says, well, let us show you, right? And it's funded by the government, supported by the government, it's in our libraries, etc. If you look at what the Jewish community has done in keeping the history and the memory of the Holocaust alive, you can see that hasn't been done in the United States. And while, of course, we will always have explicit anti-Semites, and yes, there is a rise of anti-Semitism in our society right now, for the most part, it is not okay to support the Holocaust. But the fact that this country, the Holocaust didn't happen here, right? Slavery happened here. And the fact that in this country, it's okay to debate whether or not African Americans were treated poorly or not speaks to the fact that we have not gone through that process here. So that's my answer, Truth and Reconciliation.
Thank you.
So much. I think Orrin wants to follow up. Orrin? Professor Orrin is here.
Thank you. If I may, really only if it's okay, just on a couple of things that Courtney said, which I really appreciated. But I think Wilkerson really would say that caste is different from race, and it's not just nomenclature, and that caste is so much even further embedded, structurally embedded in American society, and that's part of the problem. And I also, again, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I am sometimes. When people say, do we really want to live in a society, in an unequal society? I'm afraid sometimes that some people would like to live in an unequal society. I think that's part of the problem, is that there's so much riding on our inequalities. As Wilkerson shows, I mean, there's so many passages, scenes in the book that made me cringe, not just because of the horror, because of the way I felt implicated by them. Micro aggressions and issues that we all, we've got to be honest, that impact so many of us. And so I think part of the problem is that we're invested in an unequal society. And until we divest from that, that's going to be part of the challenge. And I just want to say about Germany, I mean, so I actually lived in South Africa before I came to Miami, and I lived there right after the Truth and Reconciliation process there. And it was an unbelievable time to be there. And I think, at the time, it was a time of great promise. And it was a really remarkable and incidentally remarkably Christian process of truth and reconciliation that the country went through. Germany did not go through such a smooth process. And I think a lot of people forget that in terms of the generational shift. The first generation after the war did not want to talk about it. The second generation did not want to talk about it. The third generation started asking their grandparents questions, where were you during the war? And only then did Germany really start coming to grips as a society. Yeah, there were reparations payments, but that was kind of a transactional thing that happened earlier. And so I think Germany is still struggling, as people in the chat have pointed out. I mean, anti-Semitism is still very high in Germany and getting higher. They're still rooting out pockets of really disturbing high-level anti-Semitism. So finally, I just want to say the importance of landscape in terms of history and memory and these monuments. Not just the fact, as Courtney said, that Miami doesn't have a place where we can recognize and remember the terrible history of lynchings, for example, but that we don't have enough of a sense of local history that can bring us to those places and to really interact with the landscape and to really deeply understand. I think this is part of what, as a country, we have to go through. We have to have the opportunity on the ground level to take people to sites and to have them see through what has been paved over or built over, and see through it to understand really how much the landscape has been scarred by this history. And that is part of what will help bring us to a greater level of reconciliation.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and inject another question. So Wilkerson speaks brilliantly about the hidden caste system in our country, and she makes the point that a caste system requires a bottom rung for those in the middle to measure themselves against, right? Otherwise, you don't know where you stand. My question is for Dr. Russell. Given how divided our republic is, in what ways do you feel that the election of former President Barack Obama as our first Black president, and now Kamala Harris as our first Black VP, has done more to help or hurt the Black Americans in our unspoken caste, and why?
Thanks so much, Jerry. So one of the phrases I use with my students all the time is that, I don't do binaries. Binaries are evil. So help or hurt. I think we would want to complicate that a little bit. I think there are ways in which, we can certainly argue that not just the symbolism, but the sort of advent, the moment that was made possible by the ascendancy of a Barack Obama or a Kamala Harris has unquestioningly an impact on the psyche of many. Thinking about Courtney's notion of sort of the traumas that we walk around with, right? So certainly, that sort of historic moment, right? Those two historic moments, I think, have helped, at least in terms of there being what was deemed once impossible to be now made possible. But that's a very first step. It is not a panacea. And I think, certainly the backlash that came as a consequence of Barack Obama's presidency, and Wilkerson sort of talks about that in the book, bears that out. In terms of this question of whether it's hurt, I don't know that I would frame those terms. What I would say is that both instances throw into sharp relief what are a deep-seated history of race and caste in this country, and have created conditions then of sort of the surge in anti-Black terror and so on and so forth that we've seen as a consequence. I think that just to sort of recur to whether we're talking about sort of race or caste, which was Eva's question, which I think is related. You know, when Wilkerson says race is the skin, caste is the bones, we really can't like delink them, right? They're symbiotic, if you will, right? The two things work very much hand in hand. One might be the sort of ocular moment, right? The identification, right? Of, you know, okay, I'm going to put you in this place. Caste is, you know, what are the sort of deep-seated, entrenched structures that hold people in place. And any movement out of that then, right? So Wilkerson talks about she says the greatest threat to the caste system is not lower caste failure, but lower caste success, right? So we might think about Obama and Harris as examples of that, right? Of lower caste success and the backlash that comes as a consequence of that, I think is just sort of emblematic of how deeply rooted these notions of race and place really are in our society.
Thank you. Eva, do you have a short question? We're almost getting out of time. Do you have a short question? If not, you know.
No. I want to give some time. I think Artie had a question early on, so I'm done. And thank you very much, everybody.
Okay.
Artie, go ahead. You got a question? You wrote something in the chat. Artie?
I don't know if she's. Artie, you still there? Yes.
She's
Unmute.
probably muted. Remember, everybody's
Unmute.
muted.
Can we unmute Artie, please?
Okay, I couldn't unmute. I just put a comment in there. It was something that you had asked Jerry before about caste in India. And Atul is correct with saying a lot of people are accepting of it, but there is so much change going on within India. Many people don't know in the 70s, there was a Dalit Black Panther movement for the Dalits in India. So there are some changes happening and we have a lot of affirmative action and it needs to change. We have 1 billion people. So to change 1 billion people's minds in India is a lot. And there's a lot of different areas in the cities. There are things that are changing, but I did want to say that, you know, there's so many different castes. And I'm come from a lower class caste, but that doesn't mean that, I mean, there's issues of going up in society, but people are doing certain things. Like I come from a very lower caste, but my dad did become a doctor, right? There are things that he had some things, there weren't always going to be things that helped him become a doctor, right? He did have issues, but I think that there is a change in society. Now people, again, not many, but are starting to marry outside their caste. So I just wanted to make that point. So that was all I wanted to say.
Oh, okay. We're gonna close things down, but there were some folks who've been waiting to ask a question for some time. Larry Thorson, are you still in the room, Larry? Larry?
You have to unmute him. Remember, they are all muted.
Larry, can we unmute Larry Thorson, please?
No, because Larry's not here.
Oh, he left?
Yes, he left.
So is Robin still on the call with us?
Yeah, I believe so.
Robin, are you there?
I'm still on the call.
Okay, so Robin, look, I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and our panelists were so powerful. But Robin, why don't you share some closing remarks with everyone?
My closing remarks are, I mean, this was an extraordinary afternoon, and I'm so grateful that it was on Facebook Live and that's recorded. So it gives the opportunity for people that couldn't get in to hear it. And I want to thank you, André, Eva, Jerry, Deanne, Sabrina, for your incredible leadership of bringing this group together. It is an incredible group of intellectuals, and the chamber looks to having further discussions. And once again, thank you all for being with us here today. Incredible opportunity.
Thank you, Robin. And Boss Man Jerry says he has some closing comments too.
So first of all, I want to echo, thank you, Andrea. I want to echo Robin's comments. Everybody in the panel was just exceptional. We want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today. Andre, you did an incredible job as moderator. I want to point out that there was a lot of conversation in the chat Glendon Hall pointed out about reparations, and there was chit chat back and forth about, what are reparations? How can you do that? And I think that it's important for you to know that our new county mayor is going to be participating in a program on February 25th. I just got this email today and I thought I'd bring it up today. And it's called Miami-Dade County's Black Communities, History, Present, and Future. It's a conversation with the Miami Book Fair. And I'm going to read you just a little bit about this conversation because I think she has a plan for how the county is going to reassess, I think, what they're doing in the Black community. It says Miami-Dade County's Black community has been part of the bedrock of the county since its founding in 1836. In fact, 168 of the 362 men who voted for the creation of the city of Miami in 1896 were Black. But discrimination and a lack of access to capital have dogged our Black neighbors from the start, often impeding self-determination and greater successes. Miami Book Fair seeks to focus on the county's past as a means to understand the present and position the community for a better future. To that end, Miami Book Fair is bringing together an esteemed panel of influencers to discuss race, wealth, and equality, including our Black community's access to quality healthcare, affordable housing, and quality education. Panelists will come together to explore our history, but more importantly, to talk about our future. What concrete steps can we all take, supported by our county government, to ensure a future that fully includes and supports our Black communities and where Black residents can find themselves at the center of decision-making? The program will include a public Q&A. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. That's going to be an outstanding program. It's Thursday night at 6 o'clock this week. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention that our next DE&I program will be held jointly with our Women's Business Council on April 14th at 2 o'clock. And that will be a training for people to learn how their businesses could become engaged with county and with the city of Miami Beach, learn how to become registered as a women-owned or small business and be able to win contracts. So you'll be trained on how to do that. I think very, very important. And I'm proud of the fact that our DE&I was responsible for legislation at the city of Miami Beach for tracking the awards that the city offers to companies so that we can get more minority businesses and women-owned businesses a piece of the pie, if you will, in Miami Beach. So with that, again, we said we're going to end at 6. It is punto 6 o'clock. Robin loves when we're on time and hates when we're late. So I want to close the program by again thanking all of you for being with us and all of the panelists.
And
great job.
Jerry, if anyone needs any further information about, Courtney's new team or anything else, feel free to reach out to Sabrina, Deanne, Eva, or Andre yourself. Okay. Any information that the panelists had.
Thank you.
Okay.
And anyone interested in joining the chamber, please contact Sabrina. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.